Welcome everyone. So this is Intro to Wilderness Character Monitoring, and I'm just going to kick it off with kind of setting the stage for where we're at. And so I've got a little PowerPoint. Hopefully you're going to be able to see this in just a second. Into slide mode here. So everybody see that okay? So this presentation that I'm going to give was developed by the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center. Maybe many of you are familiar with that, and there's a good reason why they are putting this kind of training together, and that is because wilderness character monitoring is an interagency mission. So you see there are 4 agencies that manage wilderness. There's the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, and Forest Service. And Forest Service, by far and away, manages the most wilderness at 448 wilderness areas. So another really important reason for us to all be together on these protocols and how we approach wilderness character is because we have 36 wilderness areas that are managed by more than one agency. And so we see that across the country. So really important for us to be together in the whole premise of wilderness character monitoring. So why do we preserve wilderness character? It's because it's a congressional mandate. It comes down through the law. We need to understand the qualities of wilderness character, what the law is asking us to preserve and maintain. We need to consider interactions between qualities and describe fundamental interagency principles of wilderness character monitoring. So there are just some objectives for wilderness character monitoring. And now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Wilderness Act. So the Wilderness Act refers to wilderness character in more than one place. It doesn't define it, but it refers to it and then says, any agency administering any area designated as wilderness shall be responsible for preserving the wilderness character of that area. So we see that really clearly in the law. So it's also important to know that it's this duty, that we need to preserve wilderness character is recognized within our legislative branch. That's where we have our Wilderness Act. It's in the executive branch of all the policy manuals. It's also in the judicial branch of having been challenged and having court decisions and court cases that show us how critical it is, and we are being recognized as responsible for that. So here's just a few examples of, each federal agency has a manual and a handbook. Manual are usually the policies for the agencies, and each one of us has kind of similar language and similar things that are set forth in our policies for us to manage wilderness character. We also have had court cases, over the years of, agencies, you're responsible to see these things are preserved. So tell us how you can do that in light of maybe some actions or decisions that have been made in wilderness areas. So that's a reality, and they have been successful in holding us accountable. So what is it? It's very difficult sometimes to explain, but it has biophysical environment, which is all the physical pieces. But it also relates to personal experience, to symbolic meanings, and somewhere in the nexus of those 3 things, we see wilderness character. And therefore, it can be often tangible, but many times not tangible, which is kind of the beauty of it in a lot of ways, because this really allows to encompass, what makes a wilderness special, what do we need to be looking for to preserve? So I think that's a really important characteristic. So once again, wilderness is defined in the Wilderness Act, and I want to pull out a few words here that you might be familiar with. So these are the 5 qualities of wilderness. We have untrammeled, we have undeveloped, natural, outstanding opportunities, and other features of value. And so we recognize those as kind of 5 areas where wilderness character needs to be looked at. And so the 4 agencies that I mentioned earlier came together, and this document, Keeping It Wild 2, was written and signed in 2015. There was an original Keeping It Wild document where the agencies tried to come together and say, you know, we're all responsible for managing this wilderness system. How are we going to do that consistently, you know, without these just kind of artificial, you know, agency jurisdictional boundaries? And so Keeping It Wild 2 set the stage for that. And there were some revisions after that was kind of test driven for a couple of years. And so now our most current document is Keeping It Wild 2. Really sets the stage for protocols, provides for consistency between agencies and the practical.
Julie, you're muted.
Julie, you're accidentally on mute somehow.
That's funny because I didn't touch it. Sorry about that. So just saying that this is a really critical document to all the work we do. We refer to it a lot with the central team and always talk about it in our groups because there's some really good stuff here that we need to adhere to. So the last slide, and now it's not going to advance somehow in all sorts of issues. So my last slide, I was going to just talk about the 2020 vision, which is a document that was prior to all the Keeping It Wild and Keeping It Wild 2, that just set the goal for each agency to create a baseline wilderness character monitoring baseline assessment within 5 years. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Kate. We're going to hold questions till the end.
So my name is Kaitlin de Varona. I am a program manager with the Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, and I also am a wilderness leader for the Forest Service WCM Central Team. Today I'm calling in from the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, also known today as Asheville, North Carolina. I have 2 of my favorite and closest wildernesses here. The one on the screen on my presentation is Shining Rock Wilderness, very close to Asheville. And the one behind me here, Linville Gorge. Just like to point out some of the nearby wildernesses to me. Yeah, so Julie walked through a little bit about, you know, how the why the wilderness character framework was developed, kind of setting the stage for creating this monitoring framework we'll talk about a little bit more, and using that language directly from the Act to kind of create this framework now and moving forward. So what I will talk a little bit more about are what are those 5 qualities of wilderness character that were identified there in the law that Julie pointed out, as well as talk really briefly about the wilderness character monitoring framework that many of us are working with now and implementing on our wildernesses and forests. All right, so we'll do the 5 qualities first. The first one is untrammeled. And this is some language right out of the Wilderness Act, which is kind of cool and supports these qualities here. So wilderness is where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. Wildernesses generally appeared to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature. So when we use the word untrammeled, we're really capturing like the wildness of wilderness. And, you know, untrammeled is kind of this old word. It's a unique word that isn't present in any other land management law. And so it's unique for wilderness and the National Wilderness Preservation System. Some synonyms to it are, you know, unhindered, unmanipulated, wild. So this quality is really getting at, you know, kind of actions that humans might take within a wilderness, and saying that our wildernesses, you know, are generally free from the manipulations of humans, free from the manipulations and impacts on the biophysical environments in our wilderness, unlike maybe some of our other public or managed lands. This is kind of that space to really take humility and restraint. You know, it's often said that managers like to you know, and people in general like to tinker with land and try to make things better. And so wilderness it's really capturing, this is a place where there's less tinkering there. We use restraint. And this is really getting at monitoring or looking at actions rather than the effects that those actions have on the land. So here are a few examples of things that might degrade this quality of untrammeled. So things like maybe stocking fish in our lakes or streams, perhaps here addressing non-native invasive plant species, putting out wildfires. So those are all actions either taken, in wilderness or just outside wilderness with the intent to manipulate the biophysical environment inside wilderness. And those are all having a large scale impact to some degree. And largely these things are done for good reasons to affect the natural quality, which we'll talk about here in a minute, but it's still an action that managers are taking. All right, second, we have the natural quality. Our wildernesses are natural, straight from the act. Wildernesses protect and manage so as to preserve those natural conditions. Wilderness retains its permeable character and influence. So our wildernesses, generally appear natural in landscape. This is what we're talking about, those effects to the landscape, how are humans impacting that wilderness, and are there negative effects there? These wildernesses, we should be protecting those natural ecosystems, the air, the water, those watersheds, those ecological processes is what we're protecting in wilderness here. So here are a few examples that degrade the natural quality. Non-native invasive species, when they're creating, monocultures out in the wilderness and might be outcompeting our native species. Degraded air quality from pollutants, whether they're from nearby cities or factories. Like if air quality is being degraded, that impacts our natural quality. Other areas where there might be, dams that aren't allowing the free flow of native fish species, perhaps. All those things might degrade our natural quality of wilderness character. All right, undeveloped. Wilderness is an area of undeveloped federal land without those permanent improvements or human habitation, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticed, and where man is a visitor and does not remain. So this is the quality. The undeveloped quality is maybe the most recognizable, particularly with folks who aren't steeped in what wilderness is. This is something you'll notice when you go to a wilderness area. There aren't your picnic benches typically. There aren't your bathrooms, your visitor centers, those gift shops. And so when you get out, sometimes there's not even trail signs or blazes. So these are really your undeveloped areas. There's no one's in here driving their vehicles. There's typically not loud motorized equipment noises. And so this is kind of the most identifiable quality that people really relate to, something very noticeable across the landscape. And here are a few examples of things that might degrade the natural quality. The undeveloped quality. Things like having, motorized vehicles, mechanized transport, things like a wheeled leader or a wheelbarrow. Developments can be stationary or they can be mobile. So this one, radio collars on animals, those are signs of human occupation and developments. Scientific installations, those can all be examples of something that might degrade the undeveloped quality of wilderness. All right, next quality. Opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. So straight from the act, our wildernesses have outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation. So these are really connecting some of those experiences and some of those spiritual values that humans have towards our wilderness places. these two qualities, the solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation, are kind of specifically identified in the Wilderness Act itself. But they also capture kind of more broadly some of those connections and recreation that visitors have when they go out to wilderness. Things like, personal challenge, things like self-discovery. Those are things that kind of are captured within our this quality of wilderness character. A few things that can degrade this quality are seeing a lot of people out in the wilderness. If there's like a line as if you're at an amusement park, that might really degrade your sense of solitude, particularly if you've spent a long time getting out to an area. The Keeping It Wild 2 document that Julie showed, they decided to track and think about recreation developments within this quality. So you have things like maybe a bathroom or bridges or signs as kind of your recreational development, and they can degrade this particular quality, as well as seeing those signs of human occupation, whether it be old roadbeds that maybe folks are using for ATVs, or cruise ships or other vehicles or noises that you see just outside of wilderness while you're standing in wilderness. Those things can degrade this quality here. And then we have the fifth quality, other features of value. So straight from the Act, a wilderness may also contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, or scenic and historic value. So these are things we're thinking about here might be a very specific feature that kind of defined your wilderness. One I can think of, like Shining Rock, the one that I showed you at the top of the presentation, has a very specific place with these like bright white rocks that were known to in the history and the ancestral the Cherokee. They were important to the Cherokee there and are still important. Folks go to this wilderness to see the Shining Rocks. The wilderness was named after Shining Rock, and so that can be an other feature of value, something really integral to the wilderness, where if that feature weren't there, the wilderness might be different. Other things that can be here are like your historic, maybe a specific historic building. Maybe there's a wild and scenic river that's really important to the community there. So kind of those other features of value that are not captured in some of the other qualities, but fit really well here in the other features of value. So a few examples of things that could degrade the other features of value are, graffiti or site-specific items being stolen. Like this one is an old dinosaur bone that might, that if visitors find out, they might take it or graffiti certain areas. And some of those degradations are also things that might be out of our control. So our direct management control. Down here, you might have, a very big iconic glacier that the wilderness is named after. I believe this one is Glacier Bay Wilderness. And so, many years later, if that glacier is melting and may no longer exist, that is going to degrade wilderness character and why people might go there, and that specific, special, and unique integral feature. All right, so I do love this slide, just kind of really pointing out that each of these qualities can be independently impressive. You might have one wilderness that just has, very large and undeveloped, another wilderness that just has an incredible other features of value that is wonderful to go and visit. But really, that wilderness character is more than the sum of its parts. Just like that wilderness with all 5 of these qualities together makes something truly extraordinary. So as you may have gathered, particularly if you're just now kind of new to thinking about wilderness character and these concepts, you might have noticed that some of these qualities might have some conflicting issues to address. Kind of the big one that comes to mind is there might be some real degradation in the natural quality if you have a non-native invasive plant species that's really taking over and is outcompeting some of your native species. you may want to, it may become obvious, you may really want to participate in an action, get rid of that species, and then participating in that action and manipulation would degrade the untrammeled quality. So sometimes these are big concepts to address. They do have competing issues to think about and talk about and be really mindful when we're trying to do the best to improve or preserve wilderness character as the law mandates. So kind of a summary, wilderness character qualities, not taking action might degrade one of the aspects of wilderness character, but also at the same time, taking an action might degrade other aspects of wilderness character, and just kind of weighing those options and trying the best to preserve wilderness character as the law mandates, and just kind of recognizing that any decision may improve or degrade a combination of those qualities. And it's not almost never like really straightforward in black and white. So that kind of leads to wilderness character monitoring, what many of you may be working a lot with this year as we're continuing to implement wilderness character monitoring across the Forest Service. So we have the Section 4B mandate, preserve wilderness character. There was a long discussion, over the years about how best do we preserve wilderness character. We don't have a tool that we can use. How are we able to physically show that we are doing a great job of preserving wilderness character? So over many years, 15 plus years, this interagency team came together to construct the wilderness character monitoring framework and provide managers a tool to show and document how wilderness character was being preserved over time. And so this is something I will introduce, and then Mike will talk about a little bit more after me. So the tool was developed because really the only way to know if we are preserving wilderness character and following the mandate of the law is by monitoring it. So Julie mentioned this 2020 vision document. The interagency group came together, the heads of all the 4 agencies that manage for our wilderness areas across our National Wilderness Preservation System, and said, we're going to complete these wilderness character inventories, and we're going to implement this monitoring framework. And we'll have a baseline set now and kind of continue to collect that data over time, and we'll be able to see the trends in wilderness character over time and tell how well we are preserving wilderness character. All right, so just a few things about wilderness character monitoring. It does provide information that is nationally consistent. So all 4 agencies are using the same framework that was kind of outlined there in Keeping It Wild 2 that Julie pointed out. And it's important for it to be nationally consistent so that it's relevant at the national level and it's funded from that level. But it also is important that it's locally relevant so that managers are implementing it, so that we're using it, the tool as needed. And so there's a component that I'll go into just a touch about how it's locally relevant as well. And it allows us to see trends over time. So you can show that accomplishment of preserving wilderness character on the ground over time. And the framework is really neat in a way that it shows how well wilderness character is being preserved at the wilderness level, so right there on the ground, as well as it can wrap up to a forest level, to a region level, to a national level, the National Wilderness Preservation System. Like, how well are we doing at all of these various levels at preserving wilderness character? And Mike will show a few examples of that as well. And then it provides regional and national information that can be used to evaluate how well the policy is. And it will provide information that will endure over time and prevent that shifting baseline, something really important. So, when a staff comes in at an agency 20 years ago, they have, a certain understanding and experience with whatever wilderness might be in their footprint. And over 20 years, that may have drastically changed. But when a new staff comes over and we have staff turnover, that person just sees that as being kind of the norm. And it doesn't necessarily carry over that huge change has occurred. Maybe that wilderness has seen like a huge amount of visitor use increase, or maybe they've seen a lot of trammeling actions for a variety of reasons, and so like the character is just really different in that area. So there's a lot of ways it can change. And so by documenting the same data over time, we're able to kind of see that trend in wilderness character with data rather than the shifting baselines of new experiences of staff coming in. And then there we go. Last one is just wilderness character monitoring complements existing agency monitoring programs. So rather than having to implement a whole new monitoring program and framework, it really does a good job of incorporating existing data, using that air quality data that the forest has already been collecting for a long time, using that water quality that the EPA has already been collecting over time, and really utilizing existing data sets so that we're not recreating, recreating the wheel, but also making sure we are working to document those trends in wilderness character over time. So why do it? Like what? One of the reasons is that, that law Julie pointed out, it does mandate that we preserve wilderness character. So any wilderness can come in on kind of this line of, maybe one wilderness does have some more human influence, and maybe one wilderness is a little bit more degraded up here, but wherever it is on this line, the important thing that this framework is doing is trying to preserve that state of wilderness character at the time of designation, and not have the wilderness continue to fall down the line and perhaps get more degraded as time goes on. So it doesn't necessarily matter where it does come up on this line, but that it does not continue to slip further into degradation. A few examples here. One of the important things about wilderness character monitoring is that it is not comparing wildernesses. So some wildernesses are very different, and that's great. It's not comparing them to other wildernesses. Wilderness character monitoring is comparing it, the degradation to itself over time. So you wouldn't want to compare one wilderness that might be like right next to a city, see a lot of visitors, maybe it's very small. We're not comparing this wilderness to, a wilderness out in Alaska, the gates of the Arctic, huge expanse-full wilderness that doesn't get a lot of people. We're not comparing those two, but really just making sure, as is in the other slide, that those wildernesses are not degrading further from themselves. So all wildernesses have different degrees of wilderness character. So here's part of that, the framework that I've been mentioning. So wilderness character was defined, it's not defined in the Wilderness Act, as Julie said, but it was defined by that interagency team, like an agreed upon definition of what wilderness character is, and what does it incorporate. And then we have the 5 qualities of wilderness character, also standard across all 4 agencies, defined very well in Keeping It Wild too, something, worth a read over and over, like to really get a great understanding of what those 5 qualities are. Then we have our monitoring questions, and those are all also standard. All this standard framework helps the agencies have a common language, have a common way of monitoring wilderness character over time, and just like really providing that national consistency, all the way down to these indicators. Indicators being like your air quality in the natural quality, your water, your animals in the natural quality. So those are kind of the indicators within each quality. And then down to the measures. So this is the part where I was mentioning is kind of the locally relevant part. So all of that's nationally consistent and then locally relevant. The local part is each wilderness and agency gets to select their own measures based on, how the agency decided to approach measures. So some of those measures could be, a unit developed measure. This is really specific to our wilderness. We have this data. This is, informing our wilderness character, so we want to incorporate it. Some agencies do have recommended measures. Here's a list, and these are the ones we're saying you should pick from. Some agencies have required measures, here's a standard list, you'll pick all of these, or kind of a combination of, hey, here are some required and some pick from this list. And so this is how all the wildernesses were able to kind of have the local relevancy of selecting what measures work for their wilderness depending on their agency. And with that, I will hand it over to Mike Smith to talk a little bit more about implementing wilderness character on the ground.
All right, thanks, Kate. Yeah, so I will be talking kind of a little bit more about, I guess, well, we'll just call it implementation, how to actually do all this stuff, which Kate started to get into, but yeah, I'm going to go into a little further here. So let me get this up. All right. So yeah, we've talked about, I'll kind of be doing a little overview of a lot of other things that we've talked about before, but I don't know who was on each session, so we'll just go through each one. Kind of go through a little bit faster, but some of this will be review, but a lot of it will be, as I'm saying here, implementation. So I'm going to go through how to actually do all this WCM stuff. Yeah, so I'm talking to you guys now from Austin, Texas, which I think has always been called Austin. I don't know about its ancestral name, but it's always known as Austin to me. First thing here, kind of step back a little bit from going straight into the implementation, talk about how wilderness character monitoring relates to wilderness stewardship performance, because this is a big question that a lot of people ask us, and we've developed other conceptual models over the years, but we always seem to come back to this one. So yeah, it's essentially, the fast answer is it's what WCM, wilderness character monitoring, is one of the required elements that must be selected for each wilderness for wilderness stewardship performance. So WSP focuses on what kind of stewardship actions are going on in the wilderness. What are they doing to preserve wilderness character? So yeah, very much action based. And then wilderness character monitoring looks more at kind of how it looks more of the outcomes of, see here, that are outside of managerial control, for example. And yeah, so WCM is looking at how the wilderness is being impacted by those managerial actions that WSP is carrying out. It's important to stress that WCM is a component of WSP, and is the outcomes of the wilderness, while WSP is the action. So kind of repetitive there, but that's a question that a lot of people come up with, and if you want to, definitely try to remember these little bubbles here, how they fit into each. So moving on, this is what it actually looks like. WCM looks like as one of the elements for WSP. If you're on one of our presentations earlier, this might look familiar. Hopefully, it looks familiar. We'll have the 5 steps here, 2-point through 10-point here, and I'll go through each one. Not nearly as in detail as Jacob, Kate, and I did on Tuesday, but we'll touch each one a little bit here. So the first one is gathering up all the legislative administrative documentation that has some sort of relevance to your wilderness. So a lot of them are kind of like a plan or an MOU letter, NEPA, MRA, really whatever, a lot of times just whatever your Forest Service office has. And sometimes I'll just control find wilderness to look through and make sure that a giant plan is somewhat relevant to what I'm looking for. And then we always try to recommend making this quick Excel reference guide where you can kind of see each document as it pertains to the quality. That's so, this example here looks like it's all on the natural quality. So a little faster way to get to navigate through all your 2-point administrative and legislative documentation. And that then leads to the 4-point, which is the narrative. Again, Kate talked about this all on Tuesday, but just in case people weren't on, we'll go through this again. And so, yeah, so if you did a pretty good job kind of reviewing all these these legislative, documentation, administrative, whatever you found with those MOUs, plans, and all that. Then you'll talk to specialists and really gather a lot of information to come up with this narrative. And the big part of the narrative here is that it's the intangible part of it that Julie mentioned. So this is the big part where you kind of take the step back and look at the big picture of the wilderness. Don't get so much into the nitty gritty quantitative measures that we'll talk about. Yeah, good spot to talk about the spiritual, symbolic, what makes that wilderness important to you. And we always like to say, I think I've said before, but don't focus too much on it being negative if you can. A lot of people try to, or just kind of lose sight, say all the things that are going wrong. Certainly that's a part, but you also want to say the positive things too. And yeah, so the narrative is not monitoring, but it is important. That's why it's in red letter here, red lettering there. So then moving on to 6 point. Again, saw this before, Jacob went through this on Tuesday, but this is where we're starting to get more into the setting up kind of the quantitative part. So all these measures are going to be how we're reflecting the data that's being gathered. And you're going to be selecting 15 of the 28. You could select all 28. I wouldn't recommend it, but it is an option. A lot of it comes down to feasibility and just, if it's practical or not. And again, so 2 point, 4 point, those are done well. They should make your measure selection process a little bit easier because you're, very well informed on from your documentation, from your narrative, what your wilderness should be looking at, what it should be focusing on. And that leads to what I talked about, the whole baseline assessment, kind of where everything's going. So the report, it consists of tangible, practical aspects of the wilderness that we can collect objective numbers upon. So sort of the opposite of the narrative in a way. Well, they're both part of the same process, but here we're really just looking, you can see here, really just looking at the numbers here through the measures. The measures are how we're getting to those numbers. And yeah, it presents a qualitative data for the wilderness using data going back designation. And then 5 years, we'll look back at it and the trend to establish wilderness character. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we talk a lot about the 2 through 8. So I'll go through a little bit later, the 10 point, which is 5 years after that baseline assessment report has been reviewed and approved and, has been published essentially. So after that's done, 5 years, we'll look at it again. So this is a slide, really important. Again, 2, 4, 6, 8 point here. Expected time. We've been doing this since 2018, and this is kind of remained the same since our pilot year in 2018. Could be completely different for each person. So don't think like, oh, I finished my 4 point in 2 weeks, I must be doing something wrong, or it's taking me 8 weeks, I'm doing something wrong. This is really just an average. We're kind of guessing here. The review period, again, just something to keep in mind. Keep in mind as sort of a benchmark of how you're doing. Try to pace yourself, but definitely don't think that you need to hold yourself to exactly this time. But yeah, just a good idea of generally how long each step has taken. Now, this is a pretty important question. Who's doing this stuff? Who's doing this wilderness character monitoring baseline? So it's divided up to what we consider in-house Forest Service local unit, and that can be the managers, rangers, kind of whoever's on board, seasonal staff that have time. Yeah, who's ever on board to help out with wilderness character monitoring. And then let's say no one is. No, there's a lot of fires going on, or whatever the case is. The local unit is really booked up, but they really don't have a lot of time to be working on this type of more office work. That's where people like me and Kate as partner groups come in, and well, we're part of the central team, so we don't usually do actually the WCM. But anyway, this is where the partner groups come in. New Mexico Wilderness Alliance also we've seen help out with WCM. But yeah, this is generally how it breaks up. Either Forest Service will do it or a partner group. And we've talked quite a bit about the central team and kind of what we do, but I'll go through a little bit here. Again, how we can help to ease the workload of with the whole process of 2 through 8. So yeah, here's some tools. Kate talked about the technical guide on Wednesday. Essentially kind of like the Bible for wilderness character monitoring. Kate said, you know, she's a draft of it, using all the time. Yeah, you're really going to be using the technical guide pretty often. Portia talked about the NRM application. That's just another source for data to either enter or retrieve from. Just another place that you can look for to help you for the 8-point. And then Jim Edmonds talked about the WCM database. That's where all the data is going. I kind of think about it like a lake or a river, something like the NRM. Well, it's all going into the ocean of the WCMD. That's where potential team here will help out with that part too. We can help you enter in WCMD, you know, running late or whatever. Don't work. Don't compromise your time spent on the report because you think you need to spend time entering in WCMD. If that's an issue, let us know and we will be glad to help to make sure that your assigned, you know, report and measure selection, all that is going well. And then the PINYON page we'll talk about soon. Drew talked about that earlier. Little shout out here, office hours, a good time. You know, if you have some question that I don't know, it doesn't really work over the email. It's got a lot of moving parts. A lot of moving parts, like for trammeling. Very often we get a lot of kind of questions like that. They're kind of in the gray area. Every other Wednesday, 11 a.m. Mountain Time. And yeah, don't think a lot of people will call in, just want to hear, you know, what's going on. Maybe you hear a question that someone else has and that gets you going to think about, oh, I have that, you know, I have a similar issue, and then you end up, you know, asking questions. So, you know, just a good chance to learn a little about WCM from what other people are going through and maybe figure out something that you need to do as well. PINYON page mentions a lot of resources. This is a good place to look if you feel you're just starting out and you feel a little bit overwhelmed maybe. Don't fear. You can always talk to Kate and I or Drew to get a little help, but there's another little resource here, our PINYON page, which Julie can grant access to. So yeah, guides for each step, and then really I think important here, the templates and the examples. So, you know, you can look at what other people have done for their narratives, measure selection forms, baseline assessment reports, and kind of go from there. The tech guides on there, how-to guides. Yeah, just a really important place to go to, kind of one-stop shop and all that for resources to complete WCM. Quickly, I'll go through we got 5 minutes or so left. Lessons learned from previous years. This hasn't changed much. NRM data is notoriously, well, unreliable in some cases. So don't always think it's gonna, you know, always gonna have a problem, but you don't want to save gathering your NRM data or having to enter it in, or, you know, whatever kind of contact you're having with NRM. You don't want to save that for the last 11th hour or whatever. Want to look at that pretty early on and see if there's any errors. We found that it helps, you know, the most efficient way for WCM is to have one dedicated person, again, either a partner or a Forest Service staff. We've had once in a while maybe like a group effort. Doesn't seem to work out as well. So yeah, one dedicated person usually works out a little bit better. And then this is really important. Consider the availability of resource specialists. This hit me when I was doing a narrative. I want to get really informed on these questions before I ask them, so they think I know what I'm doing here. And I waited too long, and they weren't available for 3 months. So ask your first day. You know, is the wildlife biologist going to be gone until September? Make sure to prioritize them for your questions, because you don't want to wait 4 months and then try to get all your resources in. That's really important there. So I mentioned before kind of where this is all leading. Kate kind of talked about it as well. So let's say 2020 was your baseline year. 2025 becomes when you look at everything again to derive trends. And so we'll go through each one. A quick review here, like Kate said, the measures are going to be locally relevant. And then as we go up into the indicator and the monitoring questions and qualities, that's going to be more nationally consistent. And I am just now realizing that these measures are really out of date. Wow, I don't know how many times I've done this, and I'm just now. Anyway, Doesn't matter. The measures, it doesn't matter what the measures say. The point is that in 5 years, we'll be adding them all up. So you'll get the authorized scrambling actions we'll see here, that degraded. So you have that, and then let's say the unauthorized scrambling action stayed the same. That's usually the case. So let's say it increased or, would improve, that would kind of offset. And you can see you guys just go down, and then you'll go through each one. You'll add up all these measures to get the indicator, and you add up all those, and then you get the trends and the monitoring questions. You add up all those and get the trend and all of the qualities, which goes all the way to the trend in wilderness character. And that's great. It's improving in this outdated example. And yeah, so then you can scale all that up essentially. You just take each wilderness, you add all those wildernesses up into a region, and you can find out if your region is improving or degrading or staying the same as far as wilderness character. And then that can then be scaled up again to the whole national wilderness preservation system. That's the goal here. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say that all of the wildernesses in the entire 50 states and Puerto Rico, there's wilderness in Puerto Rico, are hopefully increasing, but at least we know. That's what wilderness character monitoring is all about. At least we'll know one way or the other, unless they're staying the same, and then nothing really changed there. But yeah, that's kind of a express version. Wanted to save a few minutes here for questions, but yeah, that's a quick kind of run through of implementation of WCM. So I will stop sharing and leave it up to, I guess Drew can take it from here for any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. That concludes our presentation portion of today's WCM section. Thank you so much to Julie King, to Kate De Varona, and Mike Smith, the WCM Central team. Also give a shout out to Jim Edmonds. Feel free to reach out to anybody on the WCM team and to get connected with our office hours or any wilderness character monitoring questions that you may have. We've been monitoring the chat, not a ton of questions. Looks like the few that were input have been answered. So just like to open up to Q&A for the rest of the session.
Oh, go
Can
ahead.
you guys hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yep. Sorry, Christian Tuttle, Salmon Chalice National Forest. My rural Idaho internet has made it so I have to call in on the phone, so I can't see chat or raise my hand or anything, hence the interruption. So you may have to mute me after my question, but is there, I recognize that the trend development period is 5 years, as mentioned. Is there any sort of provision or any sort of concern that we may be seeing acute trends or acute sort of user behavior patterns changing inside that 5 year window, that in a perfect world would sort of be caught, like if we could do a full wilderness character assessment every like 12 months or so on and so forth. But I just know in Idaho we've seen such a increase in user groups, or increase in use by certain user groups in certain areas. I just wonder if there's any sort of acute or monitoring for like acute changes inside that 5 year window.
I think that's a great question, and maybe I'll just start off and see if anyone else has something to add. But yeah, certainly we've seen that with pandemic, so many more visitors just to wilderness in general, and kind of a spike in kind of activities. And I guess to answer your question, we don't have a trend assessment per se outside of the 5 years. Units may make note, I guess, of some of these spikes, or there may be a way to kind of account for them so you can see the picture when you have your 5 year assessment.
Yeah, I'll add, good question. And so the 5 years is just when a forest will do a trend assessment report, but some of the measures are documented and collecting data annually. So you might have 5 years worth of data, but you're just like officially reporting it into the database and within the trend assessment report at the 5th year. So that would capture those annual changes that you identified.
Yeah, I didn't get too much into the weeds on measures, but as Kate said, a number, I believe five, at least five, are annual. So that we have a lot of rolling averages. So that'd be a good place where, I guess I should mention that we don't wait 5 years for entering data in, especially for some of these measures that are annually. We want you to enter in, for example, trammeling. Let's say you had a weird fire year, a lot of fish stock, whatever. You want to put that kind of data into the WCMD, or hopefully that WCMD is where we would recommend, but somewhere you want to report that annual data so that when you do go back in 5 years, it's all waiting there for you. That's a big recommendation. So we have that kind of issue when a partner leaves. A lot of times they take a lot of their knowledge with them. And so we really try to help let the office know that, they're still managing after the partner leaves, that we really want you to look at all your selected measures each year if you can,